Right, hello folks. It's me again, Chris from Remember the Regulars. What am I doing? Yeah, Remember the Regulars. That's the one. Um, so I just thought I'd come back with another video. So after the timelines one we did, I thought the next best thing to do was to kind of look at the organisation of the units that were deployed within the Home Forces in defence of the UK, and also the other units as well. So I've termed this a bit. Call this an order of battle, and it's not necessarily a true order of battle in the sense. It's just a very kind of brief overview of the units and the general hierarchy of defence in terms of the home forces. Because real order of battles, go into like uh, the various units that make up a division, for example. But I think this is kind of broadly along those lines. As always, with this video, I'm not working with a script. I can't use scripts, and everything is coming from what's in here, in the vacuum that is in the centre of my head. Um, and yeah, the general kind of overview of this video is that we're going to look at the units that were responsible for defending the UK in terms of their kind of broad hierarchy and context. And there's some things in here which the aim of this is just to give a better understanding of the units that were deployed within the UK to defend the country, and also to highlight some things that many people forget. Um, and with these videos in general, it's more about the quality of the content than how flashy the presentation is. I haven't got the time, the patience, or anything else. I can't be, I'd love to be able to do like a nice flashy presentation, but I think this presentation method gets the job done. It's similar to what I use when I'm doing public talks and all that. It'd be nice to have all singing, all dancing, flashy videos, but I just can't be bothered. I've got other stuff to be doing. So let's aim. I'm just going to aim for the content and the kind of general overview to be good enough. But anyway, hope that's good enough. Um, so let's start with this. Then I'm going to try and remember what I was going to talk about because I've literally just put this presentation together. I've had a really busy week as well, so I'm not massively alert at the minute. One thing though, the cat's already into the toilet, so there's little chance of us being interrupted so far. So yeah, that's one good thing. Anyway, let's get into this. So in terms of the home force and the order of battle, this is generally all we see today, or what the vast majority of people know about the Home Guard or the local defence volunteers. But the key problem with interpretation of the anti-invasion defence is that because everyone just focuses solely on the Home Guard, you don't see the wider organisation of which they were a part. And as I've made clear in other videos, the Home Guard were not the sole means of defending the UK during the Second World War at any point. Um, they were also not, the primary fighting force of the Home Forces or the defence of the UK either. They were just one component of a wider defensive organisation and defensive network that was massively complex, massively well organised, and as with any professional military, executed extremely well. And one of the key things today is that the Home Guard are never put into context in terms of their wider context of where they sat within the Home Forces. The vast amount of books that are written about this thing, I can't. Well, I can't think of one example where it says what the Home Guard's role is in its true sense. So this is one of the things with this video. So today, most people's mind, this is all the Home Guard were all that stood between the country and invasion. When the reality is much more different to this, as we'll see in this video. So let's start at the top. Military intelligence. So this is, to be perfectly honest, something that I've only just stumbled across, and quite by accident. So I'm currently researching the units deployed to East Yorkshire to defend that part of the country. And one of the things that popped up in one of the war diaries I'm reading through, I think it was the 2nd Division war diary, are frequent intelligence reports. And this has completely come out of the blue for me. So anyone who saw me talk on World War Two TV, if I can say it, back in I think November it was, will have seen a very similar presentation to this, but I've updated this, and one of the reasons why I've come back to this is because I want to focus more and on this as a specific kind of subject. Because usually when I'm doing a presentation, this gets like 4 or 5 minutes at the most, and then I move on to something else. Anyway, back to the point. So military intelligence. So military intelligence, as I've like I've just said, just recently found out was a key aspect of defending the UK throughout the Second World War, but in particular in the period following the fall of France. So military intelligence generally consisted of gathering intelligence on the enemy, so through various means. So this was everything from aerial photographs taken of occupied Europe, interception of radio communications, um, information that came through the intelligence network, through spies potentially and witnesses that managed to escape from occupied Europe, for example, and also things like information published in foreign newspapers, for example. And this is really, really one of the key aspects of preempting the invasion threat. So by building up the intelligence picture, the aim of this is to try and work out what the enemy is up to, break down what is termed the fog of war. So the fog of war is kind of like the unseen stuff that you don't necessarily see during wartime, because you don't have a general idea of or access to what the enemy are up to. So you have to build up this picture through various sources, and this was key to essentially preempting the invasion when it was going to come. So if you knew that the enemy were building up, as happened in the Second World War, building up troop ships and landing craft in a specific area. This can give you an idea as to where they are attempting to land, and also keeping track of enemy units is key to building up an idea of which units are where the enemy is strongly deployed, where it's less strongly deployed, and getting an idea of what the enemy's up to if they're being sneaky as well. Because obviously the enemy are going to be trying to do things like hide where the units are, for example, try to conceal things through communications methods, so using radio as little as possible to avoid intercept and things like that. And in some cases, put out counterintelligence as well to try and obfuscate the enemy's intelligence gathering efforts. So this has only just come to light to me in terms of a key aspect of the defence of the UK, the Home Forces, and also assessing the threat of invasion. So just as a little example, this is an intelligence report that I found in the 2nd Division War Diary. It's not going to be particularly clear. If you want to take a proper look at these, go to the archives and get these records yourself. But the interesting thing about the 2nd Division's diary is that they've incorporated these intelligence reports into that war diary, and these are issued on a relatively frequent basis. In some cases every day, in some cases every other day, and these include vital information in terms of allowing the military forces to assess when the invasion was going to happen. So they've got things like assessments of troop movements, assessments of shipping movements, so large liners that the Germans were using, and other shipping, so the movement of landing craft and barges from the Rhine, for example. Things like assessments of the likelihood of the enemy using things like gliders, which is outlined in this thing. So although gliders get all the attention today, I'm going to have to mention this just as a bit of an aside. Gliders get all the attention whenever someone posts a photo of an obstacle in a field. It's always an anti-glider obstacle. That's not true. The obstacles that were built in the UK to defend open areas were built primarily to hinder the movement and landing and taking off of aircraft. So the Junkers 52 was a key concern, because the idea was, as the military had seen in Belgium, the Germans had used Junkers 52s to support enemy troops that had been landed. Gliders were a secondary concern, but by no means at the forefront of the worries of landing troops in terms of the Home Forces. Other information that you get in these is also assessments of the enemy morale, the state of morale, a whole wide range of information, and these are really, really detailed, and something I want to go into more detail in the future. All being well, I'm going to be doing a talk for you, World War II TV, sometime this year, and this is something I want to focus on in this talk, is the importance of this military intelligence in breaking down the fog of war and preempting the invasion. So, right at the tip of the spear, right at the very front of preparing the country for the invasion, was this ongoing assessment of intelligence gathered on the enemy. Massively cool subject that really needs a lot more attention, and something that doesn't get enough attention. So, what we got next? Alongside this, you've got the Royal Navy and Coastal Command. So, the Royal Navy was, the naval forces of the UK, and also Coastal Command. So Coastal Command for those of you who are not aware, is the air aspects of the naval forces pretty much. So this is a bit like the RAF, but focused solely on protecting the coast and gathering intelligence. So the role of the Royal Navy and Coastal Command is completely ignored today. I've already mentioned this book, but Defence of the United Kingdom has a really, really nice section looking at the anti-invasion patrols. I can't find it now, which is a bit annoying. I've got anyway, has a really nice section on the anti-invasion patrols, which were mounted by both the Royal Navy and Coastal Command over the North Sea as a form of providing an early warning of the invasion fleet. So, in the event of the invading fleet setting sail from ports in northern Germany, occupied Denmark or Norway, then the Royal Navy and Coastal Command patrolling out in the North Sea would have pretty much been one of the first signs of first forms of providing an early warning in terms of the incoming invading fleet. So things like radar, your coastal radar, your chain home low had a relatively limited range in comparison to where the in comparison to the Royal Navy and Coastal Command. So they were patrolling right up or almost up to the occupied coast to provide this early warning. And then the secondary role of this was to attack the invasion fleet at sea. So a key thing that we see in the military doctrine documents and the war diaries is that the home forces are more concerned with knocking the enemy out in their ships than they are, quite keen on knocking the enemy out in the ships. Because if you knock them out in the ships, you'd have to shoot them when they land on the ground and use up resources and all this stuff. So, yeah, a key part of attacking the invading fleet was to attack them at sea when they were the most vulnerable, especially troops and supporting elements. So, we have military intelligence and Royal Navy. So we're not even anywhere near the coastline or the coast or making landfall in the minute. These are two things which, were kind of like right at the top of the order of battle. What we got next? RAF Bomber and Fighter Command. So obviously we know that Fighter Command was lucky and, well, not lucky, but won the Battle of Britain, and therefore the German forces didn't have air superiority over the UK, which was kind of like a prerequisite to invasion. Without air superiority, the invasion was unlikely to be able to take place, which is what we know happened today. And even if the invasion had taken place and Fighter Command had been, heavily attacked and air superiority had been gained by the Luftwaffe, RAF Bomber and Fighter Command would have still been key to defending the UK. And were very much a key part, especially Bomber Command and the various other echelons of the RAF, were key to other aspects of the defending against the invasion threat. So the RAF continued following the fall of France and throughout the Second World War, prior to the fall of France, gathering intelligence, so building up this military intelligence picture and undertaking reconnaissance of occupied Europe, so taking aerial photographs of the occupied coasts, for example, to assess where invasion craft were being moored, for example. And also with Bomber Command, they were also actively attacking these concentrations of landing craft as well, especially around Calais and elsewhere. I can't remember off the top of my head. But in terms of the invasion threat, both RAF Bomber and Fighter Command would have been key to ground attack efforts and efforts to attack the enemy on the ground. Again, which goes largely overlooked. You get things like operations to convert tiger moths to be able to drop small bombs, which would have gone out to bomb the invading forces on the beachheads, for example. And also potentially the dropping of gas on the invading forces as well was two things that were considered as part of the invasion threat. So even if Fighter Command had lost the Battle of Britain and their superiority over the country, they would both RAF Fighter Command and Bomber Command would have had a key role in terms of attacking the invading fleet and the troops as they landed on the ground and pushed inland. So yeah, the RAF were very key to this. Now the cat's decided to go to the toilet. Oh, it's the other cat, it's Poppy this time. Thanks, Pops. Anyway, Royal Artillery. So I always bang on about the territorial and regular armies and the Commonwealth forces and free forces. The Royal Artillery get even less attention than those units all put together. So the Royal Artillery were, in terms of the defence of the land, were right at the tip of the spear. So things like coastal artillery batteries were key to firing and putting down counter battery fire on enemy ships out at sea, in particular the German Navy, which was supporting the invasion efforts. So the coastal artillery batteries would have been focused on, especially 9.2-inch guns, would have been focused on firing at the enemy Navy ships to hinder their efforts at supporting the invading fleets. Things like your 6-inch guns and your 4.7s and all that would have been used for intercepting landing craft as they came in to try and knock those out and drown the troops that were inside. So this role today, which was integral to the defence of the masses of coastline that were vulnerable to invasion across the UK, is largely forgotten today, but was a key aspect of the anti-invasion defences. Then slightly inland, you get your field batteries. So, as with any military deployment of infantry, they are supported by field batteries. So these were batteries of a vast range of weapons: 60-pounders, 9.2-inch guns, 18-pounders, French 75mm guns, the ubiquitous 25-pounder, which seems to get all the attention today. There were a vast amount of weapons that were brought out of storage to replace those that were lost during the fighting in France and the fall of France. And these were deployed inland to carry out tasks such as emergency battery fire, so firing onto pre-registered targets on beaches and exits from beaches, for example, to support the defending infantry. And then also putting down additional fires as well to try and disrupt and kill the enemy on the beaches as they were landing, for example. So this role of the Royal Artillery is largely forgotten today, despite being an integral part of coastal defence and inland defence, and being the front line of defence in terms of the landscape defence. So as we're only just now, after all this, coming to the actual defence of the landscape, or the defence of mainland UK. So next, coming on to my favourites, the regular and territorial army, obviously alongside the Commonwealth forces and the Free Forces. These units were, as I've mentioned in other videos, the primary fighting force responsible for defending the UK on land. So responsible for coastal and inland defence, defending the coastal crust, occupying the various and multiple nodal points inland, the vulnerable points, stop lines for a very brief period, for example. And also a key thing here is everyone seems to think that the anti-invasion defences were purely static. They weren't. There were vast amounts of local mobile reserves deployed within the various divisions, battalions, brigades, and corps deployed within the home forces. So an example of this would be at the battalion level. So generally a battalion consists of 4 companies. Each of these has 150 soldiers, give or take. What I'm seeing from the war diaries is that it was standard operating procedure, as it was throughout the Second World War elsewhere, to do what was called, or what I term, a 3 up and 1 back deployment, or in some cases in East Yorkshire to have 2 up, 2 forward and 2 back. So you'd have 2 no, I'm not talking about battalion, I'm talking about companies now. Yeah, generally you'd have 3 companies up, so 3 companies on a coastline, and then 1 company held in the rear or held in reserve to counterattack in a mobile capacity. So although 3 of your companies in a battalion were static in their role, there was an element or an additional company held back to specifically provide a mobile counterattacking element. The defences weren't all static. And you see this carry on all the way up to, like I say, division level as well. So you get your core troops located in land who would be able to counterattack. At battalion, at brigade level, you generally have 2 battalions, especially in East Yorkshire, 2 battalions on the front line and 2 battalions to the rear to counterattack and take up defences inland to support the forward echelons. And then on a national scheme, you also have the General Headquarters Reserve, which was the national counter-attacking element or mobile reserve that was located inland, which we'll look at in more detail ever so shortly. But the GHQ Reserve gets very little attention, even though it was the last line of defence. Then we finally come onto the Local Defence Volunteers / Home Guard, and their role was initially localised defence of their immediate area, so defence of vulnerable towns and villages where needs be, which didn't require defence by the regular and territorial army, in which cases places like massively important towns and villages would be defended by the regulars, and the Home Guard would be in support. Um, and generally, the Home Guard, especially in 1940, were responsible for defending these areas and garrisoning roadblocks. But it was by no means universal that they guarded every single roadblock. You get a shed load of roadblocks, which were the responsibility of the Regs and the TAs. So at this point, the Home Guard were static. They weren't under any orders to counterattack outside of their immediate area of responsibility. So at this point, they were massively secondary to the regular and territorial army. They had very little autonomy. They were under direct command of the regular and territorial army units in their local area. In some cases, you get them given additional responsibilities, such as acting as guides to the regs and the TAs that were in their area of operations. But especially in 1940 and 41, they are purely static. They do not have um, uh, well, a massive role at this point. They sat behind the regulars and the territorial army. Where possible, where they were ordered to, they would have provided support. In some parts of East Yorkshire, the Home Guards, and I'm only speaking about East Yorkshire, this is by no means a universal thing across the UK, as far as I'm aware, but the Home Guard were under direct command. Well, this I'm stumbling on myself now. The Home Guard were under the direct command of the local battalions and the local divisions, primarily. And in the part of East Yorkshire that I'm looking at, the local Home Guard under the command of at least one battalion around Spurn Point. It was up to the battalion commander of the regulars, or sorry, in this case, the territorial army, whether the Home Guard would even be called out. So it wasn't even guaranteed that if the invasion threat or the invasion landed in East Yorkshire, for example, that the Home Guard would even be called out. So they might not even be called out to take up positions, for example, and see no role at all. But this is where seeing the Home Guard in context is key. So we see here that the Home Guard, again, as I've already said, were just one component of a much wider defensive landscape and defensive organisation, and they were just one component of this. Especially in 1940 and 41, they were more aligned with intelligence gathering and keeping tabs on where the enemy were than they were a let's just say active fighting force or predominantly active and mobile fighting force. It wasn't until late 1941, 942, 943 that they became much more mobile and had more autonomy in terms of defence, but by which time the invasion threat was largely over. They were secondary to the regulars and TAs in all cases. So coming back to the General Headquarters Reserve, so it's often stated that the Home Guard were the final line of defence. They weren't. They were by no means the final line of defence. The General Headquarters Reserve was. So the GHQ Reserve was a body of territorial and mainly regular army units. In particular, some of the more better equipped ones, especially in 1940, that were held back in inland. And the idea behind these was that they would deploy once the invasion force had started pushing land and slowed down and essentially halted, so by which time, as the enemy moved inland, they would be hindered severely by the regulars and territorial armies and the mobile reserves attached to them, and in other cases the Home Guard as well. And eventually the idea was that the invading force would stall, they'd lose momentum and halt. And at this point, a key point, the GHQ Reserve would be deployed to provide the knockout blow to the invading force and wipe them out. Key thing with the GHQ Reserve is it was vitally important to ensure that they were deployed at the right time. So if you deployed them too early, the invasion force would still have momentum and continue to push inland, and the GHQ Reserve could be wiped out. And if you deploy them too late, the enemy pushes inland and makes gains that can't be forced off their foothold. But the GHQ Reserve sat behind the regulars and territorials, and these were the final line of defence of the country, not the Home Guard. So if the GHQ Reserve failed to knock out the enemy and halt their movement inland, then that was it. Things were over at that point. The invasion force could continue to push inland and occupy and take over the entirety of the country. So when we look at the GHQ Reserve in more detail in a second, you'll see that these were the final line of defence and not the Home Guard. The Home Guards in this, and the way I've structured this kind of table shows where they sat. They sat behind the regulars and territorials in terms of frontline defence, and they sat kind of in front of the General Headquarters Reserve, who are the final line of defence. So they were kind of sandwiched between these two professional military organisations. So let's take a closer look at the GHQ reserves, and I'm going to try and remember what I was going to say about this. So your GHQ reserve were located around Northamptonshire in that general area. They were deployed under 4 Corps. So 4 Corps was the corps under in general charge of one of the two general headquarters reserves. Both of these general headquarters reserves were under the direct command of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, who we saw in one of my previous talks, and it would have been their responsibility to issue the orders to have these units deploy. Further south, behind the south coast, we have 7 Corps, and this was responsible, was located slightly behind the south coast. And then, worth an honourable mention of the 3rd Infantry Division under the command of General Montgomery, a relatively little known general. You had additional units that were deployed inland under the direct command of the Home Forces that weren't necessarily considered to be General Headquarters Reserves. So worth pointing out a couple of things here. So 4 Corps was located extremely cleverly in a key strategic location. So from this location, as we know today, the invading force under Operation Sea Lion would have hit the south coast, but at the time, the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces didn't have a clue where the invasion was going to come from, and it could have practically come anywhere, which is why 4 Corps were located at this very strategic location. So from here, they could have pushed north into Lincolnshire if the invading force landed on the Lincolnshire and Yorkshire coast. They could push into Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. If, as the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces worried throughout the Second World War that the East Anglia was the more vulnerable point of invasion, which is a key thing that's forgotten today. So they could push eastwards there to counterattack, and if the invasion force hit the south coast, they could push south if needs be to defend London and also provide an additional counterattacking element. If required, they could also push into Wales and towards the southwest as well. So key strategic location here, and these were a relatively mobile unit. And then you've got 7 Corps as well, which would have been able to counterattack to the southeast, southwest, and south coast if the invading force came there. But as I've already mentioned, the aim of these was to provide this knockout blow, and these were your key units that would have done that. Looking at 4 Corps in more detail, so these maps are from the UK Second World War Heritage website, which is the Home Forces resources in particular, which are a resource that I put together, which you can check out. I'll put a link in the description below, so you can investigate the Home Forces in more detail. So, as I mentioned, these units were generally the more better equipped units that were. I know I'm gonna have to check because I've got a shopping delivery coming soon, so I'm gonna have to wrap this up in a bit. Forgot about that. Anyway, these were some of the better equipped units. So the 2nd Armoured Division, the 1st Armoured Reconnaissance Brigade, and the 43rd Wessex Infantry Division, which was a TA unit. These were supplied with vehicles to allow them to be more mobile and to provide this counter-attacking role. And then we come to the 7th Corps. So here you have the 2nd New Zealand Division, the 1st Armoured Division, the 1st Canadian Division that made up this 2nd General Headquarters Reserve located just behind the south coast. And again, these were mobile units which could have counterattacked or were required to counterattack upon the orders of the Home Forces. So those 2 units are your final line of defence. And then, worth an honourable mention, kind of in terms of the invasion force making landfall and pushing inland, you have the auxiliary units and the special duty sections within set areas. These units weren't all over the place, but as Andy Chatterton's research has shown, there were kind of supplementing units located further inland, which would have taken on the task of resistance following the fall of the UK. So you have your auxiliary units, which would have popped up behind the enemy lines as the enemy went over them. They'd pop up and attack things like supply dumps, ammunition dumps, fuel dumps, and things like that, which should have been a key resource to the invading force and hard to replace. And then you've got your special duties section, which would have gathered intelligence and provided this to the to general headquarters and the home forces. So these two units, although not active or not active, no, that's not what I mean to say. These units would have become active had the invading force made landfall, and would have been a key part to not only knocking out the enemy's vital supplies, but also gathering intelligence and informing where the enemy were. So hopefully this gives you a better idea of the order of battle of the home forces, puts the Home Guard into context, and shows you that the Home Guard were just one aspect of the military defence of the UK, and the defence show you that the defence was much more extensive than just old men and young boys armed with pitchforks and crap weapons that would have been wiped out. This is simply not true. Anyway, I hope you found that useful. I'm going to have to get going because I'm sure my shopping's going to turn up in a bit. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to have a think about what I want to do as a future video. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed that. I've been Chris. Cheers and see you later.